All right, so last, I just want to talk about the cost and benefits of a tax. So obviously, you probably know this, a tax is used to fund the government. And depending on how much you like the government or how you feel about how big the role of government in your life should be, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. But I think at some basic level, the majority of you find that at least some government is good, in order to provide public goods like the, road system, maybe some education, if, you believe in public education, I don't know. Some of you probably want government to provide health care. Some of you might not. Military spending, maybe not to this level, maybe more depending on where you're at, but probably some degree of a military is probably useful. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, post office. Again, I'm not going to talk to you about my personal beliefs on all those systems, but some of you might like them more or less. At the very least, you acknowledge that those are functions that a government might have and that they have to use a tax in order to fund in some form or another, some form of tax or another. So if you believe those are good at kind of dispersing the benefits, producing public goods or redistributing things, you might say that there's an equity efficiency trade-off, particularly if you ignore the public good aspect of it and just look at the redistributional aspects of it. So there's equity in the sense of if you're redistributing income like you would with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, you're kind of making things, I guess, more fair or flattening the distribution for income so that there's not as extreme high incomes and as extreme low incomes, right? By virtue of having a redistributional tax scheme, you're going to have bring them down at least, more towards average, even if it's not meaningful for some, some people who are earning a lot or some people who are earning very little. But the redistributional tax should essentially flatten the distribution so that it's closer towards mean. But there's a trade-off. What's the trade-off? That there's a deadweight loss, right? So if we look at the graph, B and D are surplus that is now deadweight loss, right? Before the tax, they were surplus. Now they're being essentially redistributed away from consumers and producers and going to nothing, okay? So even if A and C were going to, people who needed money or whatever, some equitable cause, by virtue of having B and D, you're trading some level of equity for efficiency, okay? Technically speaking, if you never taxed anybody, you would be in an efficient system outside of the context of public good spending. But if you never had any redistributional taxes, you'd be in the most efficient system. But would it be fair? Depending on to whom you're speaking, maybe not. And that's a normative question. I'm not going to posit whether you think equity, like having a more balanced income distribution, is equitable or not. That's not my role. I can only tell you what macroeconomic concepts say will happen, and that's that there's going to be a trade-off between equity and efficiency if you think that is equitable. So if you, for instance, were to put a redistributional tax like Social Security on income, which is how it is now, essentially the supply of labor is going to shift in, right? So you're going to have actually can have less labor than before, because the consumers of the employers, right? The consumers of your labor are going to demand less, right? Because they know that they're going to have to pay a tax, right? Shifting in the quantity demanded, decreasing the real wage that you receive, essentially, and decreasing the overall employment rate. decreasing the employment rate, not the unemployment rate, decreasing the employment rate. So the quantity demanded for labor is going to decrease. But that being said, you might find this a valuable cause because you think that Social Security will get money into the right hands so that, people aren't going hungry in their older years. Again, I'm not going to posit on that, but just that would be the effect of it, and that would be the justification that some might give for it. So there's deadweight loss. Consumers are also losing some surplus, right? In addition to the deadweight loss that they lose from B, they're losing some consumer surplus to the tax because they have to pay the tax. Producers are losing C and D from producer surplus, D to deadweight loss, C to the tax. A and C come back to the government as tax revenue, but B and D are lost. They're just gone because there's not as many people being employed, right? The size of B and D depends on elasticity. The less elastic the supply and demand, the lower the deadweight loss. Okay, the reason being, so if we let me show you actually graphically real quick. If I had a demand curve that would look like that and a supply curve that looked like that, and I implemented a $2 tax, okay, the quantity demand shift is going to be really low, right? So this is a $2 tax. I don't know why I specified $2 when I labeled literally nothing else, but the quantity shift in the loss of quantity from equilibrium to equilibrium after the tax is going to be marginal, such that most consumers and producers are still going to get the surplus from producing and consuming, except that some of it's also going to be lost to the taxes. So the deadweight loss is going to be small, but the tax revenue might be larger. So that's why people tend to want to put taxes on things that are pretty inelastic, because there's low deadweight loss because consumers and producers aren't shifting in their quantity demand that are supplied, and because there's a pretty stable tax revenue because over time behaviors aren't going to shift in. So if you put a tax on like smoking, because smoking is relatively addictive, it's not going to shift in as much. People aren't going to stop smoking as much, at least in the short term. So the government's going to have a stable tax base. Of course, as time goes on, these goods become less and less inelastic, right? Because time is a function of elasticity. Or elasticity is a function of time, right? Over time, you have time to change your behavior. So over time, the curves are going to become more and more elastic, but also that kind of serves a purpose in that if you think that cigarettes are a good with the negative externality, you're decreasing the negative externality, so you're kind of doing good on both fronts. But the tax revenue will decrease as these curves become more and more elastic and consumers and producers shift their behaviors more and more inwards. Okay, so they decrease their quantity more and more. So over time, as things become more elastic, the deadweight loss will increase, and the tax revenue will decrease. But initially, for inelastic goods, the deadweight loss will be low and the tax revenue will be high. And like I said, for governments, that's kind of a double purpose. They want both consumers to change their behavior and consume less cigarettes, but they also want tax revenue for at least a few years. So it's kind of effective in that sense. The other effective measures, like we talked in the last lecture or so about externalities and how when there is a negative externality, the government might want to step in and help decrease they want to make sure that the good is being produced less, essentially. So they can do that with what's called a Pigovian tax, where they're going to put a tax on, one of the parties, the producers or consumers, to intentionally shift demand in or shift supply out, or shift supply in or demand in, decrease the quantity demanded, the quantity supplied. So that way you're not producing as much of a negative externality as you had before there was a tax. And again, that's a double purpose. You're decreasing the externality, the negative externality, which is actually making markets more efficient in that case. And also, you're collecting a tax revenue so that you can fund your government. So there are, positives to a tax, even though there's a deadweight loss. And the positives are kind of doubled up when you have a negative externality, or when you're using the tax to fund a positive externality. If it's simply a redistributionary tax, where you're changing the who benefits from the market, then you can say that there's an equity efficiency trade-off, but it becomes a little murkier when there's a positive or negative externality. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about taxes. So we're going to move on to consumer theory. If you have any questions about the taxes, you have a problem set coming up. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be in office hours as always from 8 to 8:45 on Wednesday. Just hit me up, email me or show up to office hours, and I'd be happy to help you. Cool. So let's move on.